Welcome again, friends. My name's Andrew Ball, and this is a little shorter session than what we've been doing so far. And probably it's designed to watch right at the end of some of the keynote sessions that you've had an opportunity to have a look at. One of the taglines that we used for Fulcrum this year, and you can see it on the screen there, is this idea, see the future, be the future. Sure, you're aware that so often when Jesus taught, particularly the parables, he often landed with this last little tagline, he who has eyes to see. He also talks about ears to hear, but particularly eyes to see. And there's this idea that in order for the church to be vibrant and alive and healthy and have an extraordinary future, we need to see that future. We need to be aware, not just cognitively, but in our hearts as to how does the church function into the future space. And if you've been watching along so far in Fulcrum, in our collective series, each of the keynote speakers have been trying to the best of their ability, alert you to the fact that things around us are changing dramatically. And we don't need to be afraid of that, but we absolutely need to see what's going on in order to make informed decisions, what I call wise decisions, about what the future looks like. As part of the introduction, I shared just recently, a fulcrum is like pulling a lever, and we need to give each other permission to pull that lever. And the idea of a fulcrum is when you pull it, you get a far greater leverage that happens as a consequence of that. And so today, just as we look forward to wrapping up Collective, whether again you're watching this online or you're in a live particular setting, just want to land this idea, have a look at what the future looks like so that you can then be the future. See it and then be it. And I'm going to give you just some closing insights that, again, for your leadership community, my prayer is that these are helpful for you as you grapple with this idea. What do we see happening around us, particularly in Australian church, Australian culture, and what does it mean for us to be the future going forward? Seeing the future, there's lots I could have put on this slide, but here's a few things that hopefully will resonate for you and help you understand how others see the future of the church here in Australia. This first one might shock many of you, but again, I'm coming from the premise of just trying to say, is it okay to have this conversation? Because I think we need to. In Australian culture now, because it's predominantly a majority atheist culture, the church is now seen as unwelcome and unwanted in its current shape and form. Now, there's a little riders to that, unless you happen to have an extraordinarily beautiful cathedral. The culture is going to celebrate the architecture of that and really want to keep that in community. But I'm essentially talking about the local, down the road community church that may have been functioning for 50, 70, maybe even 100 years, across the length and breadth of our nation, but particularly in each of the cities and suburbs in our nation. So when we step outside of our church environment, when we look back inside the church, from the perspective that an atheistic, unbelieving culture would see the church, I just want to name this for what it is. The church is seen as unwelcome and unwanted. And notice the last bit of that phrase, in its current shape and form. Doesn't mean the church doesn't have a future. Please don't misinterpret me. It just means we need to think through clearly, what does its future functionality and shape and forms look like? The other thing that I think is really critical to see, looking into the future as we think about the global pandemic that we've been living, all of us, for the last several months, is that our global digital economy in particular is stimulating this sense of lostness and aloneness. It's paradoxical, isn't it? On the one hand, we're more connected because of technology than at any other time in our lives. And yet, because we've had to isolate and lock down and go through different iterations of how we manage this virus, there's also this exacerbation of aloneness, of isolation, of how do I navigate the future space that in so many ways, if you work in the mental health arena, is precipitating a spike in mental health issues, which is entirely understandable. And we need to be gracious about that. We need to be prayerful about that. We need to be compassionate and merciful to those that are struggling with anxiety and depression and stress, suicidal tendencies, eating disorders. The whole gamut of mental health issues are playing out, and they're exacerbated by this. So that's another thing as we look into our future. Despite all of the connections, there's actually more aloneness and isolation, and a sense of I'm lost in the midst of this liminal space of where life is at the moment, and we need to see that. The third piece is that I think we will see the emergence of more intercultural churches. If you saw my keynote in one of these sessions, you will have seen I've said that one of the things that has hampered the growth of Western culture particularly is our sterility rate. The birth rates in Australia are extraordinarily low. I think at 2020 they're 1.813. That essentially means we're not even replacing ourselves. And therefore, immigration has been profoundly impactful on the future shape of an intercultural Australian society. And I think we're going to see the church in that space, if I can express it this way without in any way sounding derogatory, move out of our Anglo-Saxon enclaves into this wonderful collage of intercultural connection. And that's going to bring with it a richness and a beauty to the church that I don't think we will have seen before in our lifetime. The other thing that I see into the future is that, consistent with some of the new ways of operating, what I referred to in my keynote as the new power systems, is that we'll have innovative, life-giving, collaborative teams that will be willing to break the existing paradigms. That's a big conversation, isn't it? And again, I just would love to anchor that back to that starting question. Is it safe for us when we look into the future? Do we have permission to have some of these conversations? And I would resoundingly say, yes, we have to, because if we don't, we actually live in denial. So the future church is going to have these different, agile, innovative spaces to it, where the existing paradigms of church are going to continue to be questioned and broken. Now, I think that's a good thing. We shouldn't be fearful of that, because essentially we're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. We're not actually saying that Jesus and the message of faith through him and the gospel has changed. We're simply saying how we package that in our missiology is really important. And then finally, I see into the future that perhaps we're going to need a different architecture for church leadership. Again, this isn't new, but it's how we prioritise this idea of fivefold gifts and how each of those gifts are warmly welcomed into collaborative spaces where the church functions very differently. I could have given you probably 30 dot points on this, but these ones are quite salient, I think, as we try to foreshadow what does the future of culture and church need to look like in Australia. And for those of us who've been serving in church for many times, my encouragement to each of us is we actually need to let go and trust God so that the generations that are coming after us have an opportunity to express their faith in line with some of the trends that are actually happening, not just globally, but here in Australia. So there's some foresight, if you like. This is how I see the future when we think about transforming that future and pulling that lever, taking a pivot, thinking about the future space of the church. I want to turn now to the idea of being the future? If that's what we see, what do we need to be? This first one is something that I'm so passionate about, and it's very dear to my heart. It's the idea that we have to take a wisdom journey that's embellished and full of delightful story and narrative. It's so different, this worldview, this mindset, this paradigm, from the Greco-Roman mindset that certainly those of us who are baby boomers, I'm pointing at me here, grew up with. This is the rational space. This is where everything has to fit together and be packaged nicely with certain outcomes. Now, as I look at Jesus and his early days of ministry, he didn't do that with the disciples. He went on a journey with them, and as he went on that journey, he told stories. There was this beautiful, rich heritage of the Judeo story that was welded in theology and grounded deeply as they were mobilised to represent the Messiah's agenda and the coming kingdom. So one of the things we have to be into the future is treasured communities where the Christian tradition is told in ways that maybe even artful ways that help pique the intrigue and the interest of those around us. So that rather than arriving in community where we presume that we've got all of the answers to the predicament that's confronting Australia, on the contrary, we arrive in the community and we share our story and we invite others to become collaborators and participants in that story. And the thing about that story is it's a very deep story. It's a wisdom journey rather than purely a cognitive, pragmatic story. So in order to be the future, I think that one lever there is extraordinarily important, thinking about the future flourishing of the church. The second piece that I think is profoundly helpful and very critical is for the church to think about how it contributes into the place-making space. For some of you in church leadership, I'm acutely aware that may well be a foreign concept, but it's the idea that if you were to start again, what kind of place would you create? If you weren't necessarily tied to the suite of facilities that you currently have, what would you dare to dream that the church in its fullness might look like in your community? This for me is a fascinating conversation because it does pull a lever. It does actually unshackle us from some of the old paradigms around how we might have done church. Many of us have been schooled in the idea that in order for the church to flourish in its community, we build an auditorium, a chapel, a sanctuary, doesn't matter what you want to call that, and we build a whole lot of activities around that. And all of you would know that's what we've called traditionally Sunday-centric mission or ministry. But what if we were to change that? What if we were to ask, how does the church be present, and how does the church be a place that contributes to the life and the well-being and the vitality of the community that you find yourself in? This is a very rich conversation. This future is perhaps less about the church trying to self-define itself and the church repositioning itself in its community to serve the culture and the essence and the strategy of that community. So for example, if you're located in a city, what would it look like for your church to actually serve the vision and the strategy of that city? Can you see the difference? One paradigm is we devise our own strategy and we invite people to come and join us. The second strategy is the church becomes an active place that's welcomed in community because it actually adds contributions. It value adds the strategy and the vision of the local city or the local community. I think that's such a rich, beautiful wisdom conversation. Imagine, for example, going to your local council, to your mayor and saying, we've read your strategy, we understand your heartbeat as a city, and we've now actually decided to make contributions to bring spiritual resources, Christian spiritual resources, to that strategy. Can you think about how that changes that first idea that I was talking about previously? We are unwelcome or unwanted in our community. I suspect it will shift to, wow, this church actually wants to contribute to the life and the well-being of our community. The third dot point here is this idea that we're going to become localised. So much of what we do, have done, continue to do in many ways is to benchmark ourselves around the best of the best around the world. And in many ways that's great, isn't it? Except what happens if you don't have the same prerequisite resources in your church to copy or to mirror or to franchise the church on something that's happening in another part of the world? And I think that's also a major lever that you want to have a conversation about. Do we need to be the same as what has happened over there, or can we envisage localising our mission so that we move away from the pragmatics of ministry and think about how we value out our community? In this sense, I think we will become makers of social enterprises, makers of small businesses, capable of taking all of the Christian values that we hold dear to, but applying them in ways that are profoundly different to how the church has previously functioned. In this small session, I don't have time to unpack all of that, but there's some very deep strategic shifts in that. It implies that the church is way more than a worshipping community. The church is a healing community. The church is a sending community. The church is a community that's called to partner with God around the redemptive purposes that God has for your particular city. I think that's, again, another very rich conversation that's worthy of placing into the forward agenda of the church. We're a family of churches. We're a movement of churches. We happen to be at least 170 odd years old. And that also brings some future challenges for us. And I'm delighted, even though this will be my last collective to have the privilege of inputting to, that our conference executive, with my endorsement, is recommending that Daz Farrell picks up the baton and leads us into the future. You know why that's important? He's in his early 40s. I was in my early 40s when I took on this role. It's a very concrete way of saying to our family of churches, we're going to pass the baton on deliberately and willingly to the next generation, mindful of the fact that they're probably not going to do church or mission or function the way that necessarily you and I would do that. It's a letting go in order to allow God to reshape it. And I think for the future of the movement, there are probably some shared values or principles that we still need to create that still allow this expressive freedom to happen across the architecture of the movement, so that we're not a church, a collegiate church that says to everyone, you have to conform to the same form or style of church. We're diverse. We offer multiple connection points for people to connect with God. And finally, our future has to be one of renewal. I'm convinced there can be no revival, there can be no restoration even of New Testament practice, unless first there is renewal of the mind and the heart. This is such a pivotal lever for us to pull. For those of us that work collaboratively in leadership teams, are we being renewed by the Word of God, by the Spirit of God, in the community of God, in wholesome and transformative ways? That's a question we have to ask each other, because it's so easy, isn't it, for us to become dry and stuck and find ourselves trading off maybe what we learned a decade ago and losing our sense of currency. I'm so delighted that we're in this current space, because the current space allows us to think about the future space. And part of that is to go, unless the Spirit of God is evoked, given permission to be at work renewing our mind and your mind, transforming my heart and your heart, then my fear is we rely solely on our human intelligence, which makes no space for God to intersect with us. In closing, this is one of my favourite verses. Because we are his children. It's just a wonderful beckoning, an invitation from God through his word to say, you know what, we're all children of God. I continue to teach this passionately wherever I am. In God's economy, there's no difference between genders and class and race. Even between our gifts, we're all equal in the economy of God's kingdom. The only difference between you and I is that I have certain responsibilities that come with the role that I've been tasked to do on behalf of God's people. So God here beckons us again. We are his children. Note the line of Jesus, unless you become like children, you cannot enter the kingdom of God. There's this overwhelming humility that we've got to start again as God's kids. And God sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, prompting us to call out, Abba, God, we so need you in these days to do everything that you need to do in our hearts and minds, to give us permission in safe places to pull those levers, to evoke the fulcrum, to ask one another, well, you know, if some of what we've been learning over these few days is true, so that we don't lose it, how do we actually harvest it and mine it and see what God might be saying to us through his Spirit and through his word for the future? I'm profoundly hopeful for the future of our movement. Let me tell you why. Because we are practicing some of these practices already. We're more concerned about the future than the past. Can't change the past, can you? Our past is important because it reflects our heritage, but the past has been and gone. The future is something we need to look into, and we need to make decisions to not sit back together and say, well, I'll just critique this and wait and see what happens. My closing appeal to you as brothers and sisters in Christ, don't be an armchair critic. Don't sit back and say, well, it's all right for that generation to want to embrace the future. Choose in your mind and heart to be solutions focused, to make contributions that help our next generation. Do everything that they can do under God to make his church flourish, so that we are welcomed and appreciated and affirmed and treasured in the cities and the communities across the length and breadth of New South Wales and ACT. Who wouldn't want to belong to that kind of church, where the community says, wow, there's something extraordinarily wise and deep about these people. And they keep telling stories, not just about Jesus, but about how their own lives have been transformed with fresh hope, found only in Jesus, that encourages them to continue to persevere until God comes again and redeems his world. These are, in many ways, extraordinary days. And I want to thank you again for the opportunity and the privilege to have had my hand on the plough for the last 18 years. I really look forward to watching with anticipation and excitement at what God's going to do in the next decade. Because in many ways, my job has just been to steward what God has been doing, and then to willingly hand it over to the next generation. And I pray that you be willing to do that as well, for the cause of God and his kingdom. God bless you.